Welcome to part 2 of my Unitale Crash Course. If you're new to Unitale and want to properly follow along, please watch part 1 first. I am using Create Your Frisk in this series, which is the new and improved Unitale engine. I'm still going to refer to it as Unitale sometimes for the sake of convenience. Anyways, in this episode we'll create 2 different act commands. The first one will allow you to apologize to the monster, which will turn the spare command yellow. The second one, pose, will cause the monster to say different things depending on how often you've posed previously. Let's jump right in. I'm going to once again copy my Encounter Skeleton folder and rename it to Tutorial2 to keep things organized. Open up poser.lua and direct your attention to this part of the file. This is a function. Let me explain what functions are and what they consist of. Functions are where the functionality of your code is located. Variables and functions are 2 of the most basic and important aspects of most modern programming languages. The variables are the data and the functions contain the logic which operates on that data. Let's dissect the existing function handle custom command to see how functions are written in Lua. First, the start of a function is declared by the function keyword, a keyword being a word that's reserved for a specific purpose. Right after that comes the function's name. In this case, the name is important because Unitale looks for a function specifically called handle custom command. It is supposed to contain the logic for the act command, so don't rename it. After the name come the input arguments for the function, which are specified in the brackets. This function only has one input argument called command. Whenever an act command is selected, the function's name will be given to this function as a string variable. Let's ignore the code inside of the function for now and skip right to the end. There we will find another keyword, end. It obviously indicates the end of the function. Let's explain what the function does. Almost all code in the function is an if-statement. What it does is that it checks if conditions are met. Remember, I said that the command that was selected is given to the function. First, it checks if the command's name is equal to act1. If that's the case, then the monster will say selected act1. If this condition is not met, this code will not be executed and the if statement will check if the next condition is true. In our case, that's whether or not the function's name was act2. Same as before, if that's the case, the monster will say selected act2. The last check isn't any different. Finally, the if statement is ended with the keyword end. After that, the dialog which appears in the arena is set. And that's all this function does currently. Let's make it more interesting. First, let me show you where the names of the act commands are defined. At the beginning of the file, you can see a variable called commands. This is a table. It is a type of variable which can hold multiple values at once. All of these values need to be of the same type though. In this case, it's a string table which contains all of the act command names. Let's rename our act commands. Change the first entry to apologize. Because our first act command isn't called act1 anymore, we need to change the name in the function as well. What's very important is that the name must be written in capital letters. Before this line, let's add the code which will make the monster spareable. We already have a variable that's determining whether or not the spare option will end the battle, called canSpare. It is currently set to false. Once the apologize option is selected, we just set the variable to true and Unitale will take care of the rest. Now, the apologize function shows up in the act menu and selecting it will turn the spare option yellow. Now, let's change the monster's dialog to something more unique. This variable, current dialog, is responsible for that. It will replace the random dialog of the monster to something specific. Let's change it. Select the command in battle and... Huh? The dialog continues outside of the dialog bubble. Why does this happen? Well, I'm glad I asked that question. There are no line breaks in our dialog. Line breaks are created with \n, but adding them is very tedious and obscures your dialog. Plus, you need to check if you put line breaks in the right places by painstakingly testing the battle over and over again. Luckily, in Create Your Frisk, There's a way to automate this process. In your Lua folder, open the Encounters folder and open encounter.lua. Add a variable somewhere called AutoLineBreak and set it to true. Now when the monster says its dialogue, it will stay inside the dialogue bubble. Just make sure that your dialogue isn't too long or it will not fit inside the bubble. If you want to add even more dialogue, remember that the variable current dialogue is a table, thus it can hold more than one value. Just separate the dialogue by commas like in the other tables at the top of the monster file. Now I've taught you the basics of monster dialogue, but there's a second type of dialogue. I'm referring to the text that appears in the arena. Unitale calls this the BattleDialog. Currently, the BattleDialog just says which act command you selected. But we want the dialogue to change depending on the act command we select. So cut out the line at the bottom and paste it into our if statement. Then set it to something that gives the player an idea of what they just did. Now when you select the option, your text will pop up in the arena. Let's create the pose option. Like before, change the name in commands and in the function. Let's also delete the third entry from the table and the if statement. Because we want the monster's dialogue to change based on our amount of times posed, we need a variable to keep track of that. We'll call it Posecounter. Congratulations, you have created your first normal variable. If you don't use this variable in a function, it won't have any effect on the battle. Let's set its default value to 0. Now we need to add our own if statement inside the already existing one, exactly here. Let's get rid of the current dialogue for now. Okay, start by adding if. Now we need a condition to check for. Let's check if our pose counter is currently 0. Do this by adding Posecounter, then 2 equality signs, and lastly a 0. Also put a then keyword behind all of that. Let's break down what we just wrote. We specify which variable we want to check. We say what value we want to compare it to. And we check whether or not the variable is equal to 0. Now let's add some monster dialogue. For readability, indent the next line and add some dialogue like I've showed you. Also add a BattleDialog. Now let's check if the pose counter is 1 as well. You can copy the code from above, just make sure to change the 0 to a 1 and add an else right before the if without a space. Only the first condition in an if statement contains an if. All checks after that need an else if. Lastly, copy the code again, but this time remove the check entirely and just write else. When both conditions above aren't true, this block of code always gets executed, regardless of the value of Posecounter. Now there are just 2 more things we need to add. First, end the if statement with the end keyword. Now comes the crucial part. We need to actually increase the value of Posecounter every time we pose. Right now it stays at 0 and we won't get to see the other dialogue. To increase it, add the variable's name first. Then use 1 equality sign to assign a new value to it. Now write the variable's name again and add a +1 behind it. This code sets the value of Posecounter to itself and adds 1 to it. Let's test it out. We can see that the dialogue changes depending on how often we select pose. Now feel free to play around with the code a little and add more dialogue if you want. I also recommend that you check out the Create Your Frisk documentation. It is an incredibly valuable resource for learning and is written in an easy to understand way. And that's it for this tutorial. In the next one, we will learn how to add items to your inventory. Creator out.